So welcome everybody to The History Effect, which is an online series which is produced by the History Council of New South Wales. This week we have been looking at the question of the Spanish flu and using it as a kind of point of conversation to open up conversations about what is going on for ourselves right now. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal clan of Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians on the land on which the History Council has its offices at the Justice and Police Museum site. And to pay our respects and my respects to the elders past, present and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the Bidjigal people whose custodianship continues in the country where I currently live, around Botany Bay. So many of you, I hope, will already know Associate Professor Nancy Cushing. She is an environmental historian who is based at the University of Newcastle. She's interested in how histories of humans are entangled with those of other animals, be they large animals like cattle and kangaroos, or microscopic ones such as virus and bacteria. She's the Vice President of the History Council of New South Wales, and she's a member of the executive of the Australian and New Zealand Environmental History Network. Her most recent book, which is called Animal Counts, is one that she co-edited with Jodie Frawley. I think it's also worth just remembering that today is World Environment Day, which is celebrated on the 5th of June every year and is a sort of the United Nations principal vehicle for encouraging awareness and action around the protection of our beautiful environment. And hasn't it been fantastic to see how the slowing of pace around the coronavirus has just seen, you know, we've had glimmers and tastes of what it's like to have an environment that's got less pollution in it. I've certainly enjoyed that. So the Environment Day actually started in 1974 and it has been a flagship campaign raising environmental awareness about marine pollution, human overpopulation and global warming ever since. So it seems very fitting that we would have Nancy talking with us today. And today Nancy is going to talk to us about a little treated aspect of history associated with the Spanish flu pandemic. And that is the campaign of inoculation that was undertaken under the auspices of the Australian government. But as Nancy's going to tell us, just like it is now in 2020, there was no vaccine in 1919 to cure the illness. Nonetheless, 40% of the population was submitted to some sort of injection, which Nancy's going to tell us more about. So Nancy is going to focus particularly on the suite of measures that were undertaken with a focus on the Hunter River Health District. Welcome, Nancy, and thank you.
Thank you so much. So I'll just share my screen, try and get my slides up. Okay, welcome everyone. Friday night and the end of a long week, and I wasn't sure how many people would actually be here, so I'm really pleased to see how many have come along and to see some Spanish flu history royalty out there. So now I'm feeling like, gosh, I'm really looking forward to any comments or questions at the end. So I am going to talk about the inoculation aspect of the flu. So as the COVID-19 pandemic has continued, many have looked back to the Spanish flu for some insights into the course of the disease, how people coped, and the measures taken to try to limit its spread. Likely because we have such confidence in medicine now and that it is greatly advanced since 1919, and because we're dealing with a different virus, while we've noted the use of masks and physical distancing, there's been little attention to other measures taken to protect themselves from contracting influenza.
SMSA.
Can I just remind everyone to please mute themselves?
So while we have our hopes pinned on the development of a vaccine, there have been few references to the campaign conducted by Australia's federal and state governments to inoculate the citizenry during the Spanish flu pandemic. When a vaccine does become available, perhaps this aspect will become of greater interest. So tonight is our chance to get ahead of the curve. Since each of those who have already spoken in this series have mentioned inoculation, I'll also be referencing back to some of the earlier talks and sort of tying together the series of talks we've had this week. So many of the claimed means of warding off influenza were long established. As Lisa told us, cleansing of streets and premises, an approach that was useful in fighting the bubonic plague because it reduced rat populations, was also undertaken as a measure against the pneumonic flu. As the flu set in, compulsory wearing of masks and closure of places of public gathering was also undertaken. So here in this first slide, I've got the residents of Hamilton, one of the council areas in Newcastle, were being told to destroy refuse and burn it and thoroughly cleanse their premises. So things that were not necessarily actually going to help them against this virus, but would have been useful against the bubonic plague. So there was some slippage. And then here is evidence of the sort of measures that were being taken at a state level to do what we would now call masking and social distancing. So the closure of billiard rooms and libraries, theatres, music halls, proclamation regarding the holding of church services and the closure of schools. So all of these things were happening. At the level of the individual, although one of the informants we heard during Layla's talk said Aspro was unheard of at the time, it actually was around. Aspirin had been sold in Australia by the German company Bayer before the war, and the authorised Australian producer renamed their product, patriotically, Aspro, in 1917 to distance it from that enemy company. Dosing with aspirin was considered not just to be a treatment for someone who was sick with the flu, but also a preventative. Drinking the new beef extract known as Bonox, taking Dr. Morse's Indian root pills, sucking on a variety of aromatic lozenges, as you'll see some of them being advertised here. Pruno was one of the brands that was saying that it would help with pneumonic influenza. Having bad teeth pulled, that's what the dentist is advertising there on the left, that mouth hygiene is a necessary safeguard. And so kind of in contrast with us now where a lot of dentists closed down, they were encouraging people to go to the dentist and have their dental hygiene attended to. Or a favorite, drinking alcohol, preferably whiskey. They were all recommended to protect against the flu. Some swore by eating raw garlic, or frequent bathing, or Epsom salts taken each morning. Other methods against the flu were more new and considered modern. So we've heard references to the sulfate of zinc inhalations offered to servicemen and employees of large companies to disinfect the airways and keep the flu away. And so the image on the left is of the inhalatorium in the Kodak factory in Melbourne. Around Newcastle, there was a lead and zinc refinery called the Sulphide Works near Lake Macquarie at Cockle Creek. And so the article here is actually saying that there are no cases in Cockle Creek. It's so healthy there because they have the fumes from the refining of zinc in the air, which in the long term, they've discovered was really not such a healthy thing to be breathing in at all. And they have serious problems there with air pollution still. Large-scale inhalation chambers were set up in public buildings and in train stations to meet the requirement that people pass through an inhaling chamber within 24 hours before train travel. In a now familiar turnabout on advice, the New South Wales government in April 1919 officially announced that they were valueless, the exposure to these fumes, and perhaps dangerous. So where they had required people to go through an inhalation chamber, they then reversed and said it isn't worth, it's not helping and it might be harming. So along with all of these efforts, Australia was unique in having an official national campaign of inoculation, which started before the flu arrived. So then, as now, Australia was fortunate that the flu arrived on our shores after it had arrived in many other countries, and we were able to apply lessons that they had learned there. Research done by medical scientists overseas helped Australian authorities to decide upon the strategies that would be used here. A suite of measures was put in place, as we have heard about this week. Influenza was made a notifiable disease under the Public Health Act. Regulations were set up to quarantine those entering the country or crossing state boundaries, and buildings were commandeered for emergency hospitals, and relief committees were set up to help people who remained in their homes. So inoculation was part of these measures, but one which was approached perhaps more cautiously than some others. As we have heard, no one in 1918-19 really knew what was causing the flu. The virus that we now recognize as the influenza virus was too small to be isolated using the available technologies, although scientists were aware that there was a filter-passing organism that seemed to cause a feverish cold. German bacteriologist Richard Pfeiffer had identified a bacillus during the influenza pandemic of 1892, and it was given the name of B. influenza, now Haemophilus influenza, which was understood to be associated with the disease and present in some, although not all, Spanish flu victims. What was being observed was that the flu virus left people vulnerable to secondary bacterial infections caused by pneumococcal and streptococcal bacteria. Even at the time, it was recognized that inoculation would not prevent or cure the flu, but it was hoped that it could reduce the toll of these secondary infections. So I should stop here just for a minute to untangle some closely related terms: vaccination, inoculation, and immunization. And so here is a card that was issued to servicemen to certify that they had received some of each of these. And so you'll see that the serviceman has been vaccinated against smallpox and inoculated against typhoid fever. And this is in 1915. So immunization is the end goal, at least temporary immunity or resistance to an infectious disease. Vaccination was the term used by British physician Edward Jenner in the 1770s for a process of injecting a small amount of disease-bearing matter into a healthy body to generate antibodies, which would also prepare it to counter the larger threat posed by a serious disease. And so for many people, for medical people, the term vaccination was still only used with regard to smallpox. Inoculation is a term for administering a vaccine by any means. So you could be inoculated with a needle, as they were using in 1919, orally, or with a nasal spray, for example. So we are inoculated with a vaccine to achieve immunization. Inoculation was the preferred term used in 1919, although not exclusively, but I'll repeat their language. So in the US, vaccines were trialed with a number of health and naval populations from October of 1918. And it was concluded that those inoculated were less likely to come down with the flu, and if they did, more likely to survive. The disease came later to the west coast of the US, and there they used the inoculation process to good effect in San Francisco. And some large companies, like the US Steel Company, used it extensively, inoculating almost 300,000 of their employees. Experiments were also going on elsewhere, as with the British Director General of Army Medical Services, who declared the production of vaccine a great and urgent importance in mid-October 1918. 1,000 boys were used as test subjects, given a vaccine at the Royal Hospital School. But in Britain, inoculation really didn't take off. People were very suspicious of the process at the time. And in contrast with our current experience, New Zealand, now being at the cutting edge of some of the measures against the coronavirus, did not embrace the inoculation process. It was not used at all there in New Zealand. So at a high-level meeting of Australia's state and Commonwealth chief medical officers, state health ministers and members of the British Medical Association in Melbourne in late November 1918, it was decided that based on positive claims for vaccines in reducing the deadliness of the flu, the Commonwealth would pay for citizens to be inoculated with 2 doses through a scheme to be delivered by the state governments. The work would be done by the new Commonwealth Serum Laboratories in Melbourne, which had been established in 1916 to fill the gap wartime demand had created in imported supplies of serums, vaccines, and antitoxins from overseas. Drawing upon research conducted elsewhere in South Africa and in Britain, and samples of bee influenza sent from Western Australia and quarantined patients, so those who were caught in the maritime quarantine. In December 1918, scientists from Commonwealth Serum Laboratories, or CSL, produced a wide spectrum vaccine effective against bee influenza, Streptococcus, M. cataralis, and other bacteria, manufacturing 3 million doses by the 15th of March 1919. So the states responded with varying commitment to this inoculation initiative. Here in New South Wales, which is what I'm going to focus on, the Minister for Health and Local Government, Jack Fitzgerald, announced that the whole population should be inoculated against the flu. Healthy people held in quarantine on ships were immunised before they were released. In the cities, suburbs and towns, depots were set up, some in the newly redundant recruiting offices, where serums could be stored and administered. Advertisements were placed, and doctors and voluntary aid detachment nurses awaited arms to jab from 27 November 1918. But the big question was, would the people come? It wasn't a compulsory immunisation like the smallpox vaccine had been in Victoria since the 1850s. And people knew that what was being offered was not complete protection from the flu. When the campaign started, there were no known cases of Spanish flu in the community. So there wasn't that great, there was a lot of anxiety hearing what was happening overseas, but it wasn't like, my neighbour is sick, I should really get this done. Even J.H.L. Cumston, the country's chief medical officer, admitted that the effectiveness of vaccine treatment was debatable and uncertain. And the health officers in South Australia agreed that inoculation was not useful and potentially harmful, making it a private matter between individuals and their doctors in that state. So compared with our annual campaigns around flu vaccination, how much harder would it be to convince people to take the flu shot when there was less familiarity with immunisation in general and no claim that it could be made to provide complete protection? So many people did not put themselves forward for inoculation for a variety of reasons. Cases in which people were inoculated and then contracted the disease were publicised, causing concern. So here, just at the very top, Miss Fletcher, age 19, the Newcastle pneumonic influenza patient, had recently been inoculated in Sydney. So they're drawing attention to cases where people are inoculated and then become ill and trying to, see if there's a connection there. I included the rest of this story, and this is really off topic, but it's talking about that you shouldn't go shopping, you should have home delivery, you should be ordering your goods, I almost said online, you should be ordering your goods through catalogues and by telephone and telegraph and so on. And I just thought that's a really nice comparison with the present day as well. So there's so many of these parallels that go through all aspects of people's lives. Some people prefer to try to protect themselves and their families through their own strategies, as we heard in Grace Schwebel's oral history. Some had particular concerns, like the author of this postcard, who did not want to be inoculated because of the use of calf blood in the process of manufacturing the vaccine, which she feared might expose her to diseases like bovine tuberculosis. So I just have to stop and just say a little bit about this, because yesterday I did not have this piece of evidence, but through the wonders of the internet and Australian Story on Monday and so on, someone who did have this, a researcher at ANU, contacted Peter Hobbins, and Peter CC'd me in on an email, and long story short, I've been allowed to use this tonight, and I'm really appreciative of Emily Gallagher for reaching out to us, and for Lawrence Malloy for realizing that the documents he had in his family were really something quite special and something that researchers would be interested in. So she was quite right in thinking that animal products were used in the production of the vaccine, including sheep blood in the agar mix on which the cultures were grown, and horse, cattle, and rabbit meat and blood in the media for the active ingredients. Others were either complacent or fatalistic regarding the idea of being immunized with disdain or even contempt. And some believed that the flu was so fearsome that inoculation couldn't stop it anyway, so why would they bother? Others, in their thousands, did roll up their sleeves. These people might have gained some confidence from the use of other relatively new vaccines at the time against rabies, typhoid fever, and diphtheria. Those who had served in the armed forces, as we've seen, had had some of these shots, and so they knew what to expect. Having read about the dreadful effects of flu overseas, many were keen to do what they could to protect themselves, their families, and their livelihoods. In some cases, people were inoculated in their workplaces, where it might have been difficult to say no. The injection was even believed by some to have additional positive effects, including the relief of arthritis. So I'd now like to just take a bit more of a close-up look at how this played out in the busy port of Newcastle. And it's clear that a genuine effort was made there to ensure that as many people as possible were reached by this campaign of inoculation. And this was particularly important because people were supposed to submit to 2 doses. So if you had a bad experience on the first, you'd be unlikely to come back for the second. So they wanted to make it easy. And we heard the story from Joyce Higgins, who recalled the use of a blunt needle had left her cousin with a mark on her arm the size of a florin for the rest of her life. So we wouldn't want that. And so rather than expecting people to come to Newcastle Hospital for the shots, they took them out to the municipalities, to the separate council areas that made up Newcastle, including here at the Hamilton Municipal Chambers. And they didn't just run the clinics during the day, during working hours, they had them at night and on Sundays so that working people could attend. They employees of certain groups like Newcastle City Council and the railway and tram departments were brought as groups to have their shots done, and children were immunised en masse at school. After the early rush, when people were awaiting the appearance of the flu in their community, numbers seeking immunisation did decline. In March, when the flu had reached Newcastle, it didn't come to Newcastle until late in February. The headlines were proclaiming flu in Newcastle, citizens very uneasy, but only 7 people turned up at the Newcastle depot for inoculation. So that might seem counterintuitive, but it was partly personal choice and also public policy, as they were shifting to physical distancing, not wanting people to gather. And they were also worried that receiving the inoculation would weaken people's systems somewhat and make them more vulnerable now that the flu was out there in the community. Some leverage was employed to ensure continued inoculation, with railway travel between centres restricted in April to those who could show that they had had a flu shot in the past 3 months. Not wanting to completely block mobility, compliance was facilitated by placing a justice of the peace and a doctor at major stations, including Newcastle Station, to enable people to swear that they had been inoculated and be issued with a certificate, or to be inoculated on the spot in the booking office hallway. So probably not much privacy around that, and the inoculation they had that day was not going to help them if they were exposed to the flu on the trip. Free immunisation officially continued until the 17th of May, although I found an inoculation clinic was held in the Newcastle Council area as late as the 1st of July, although only 10 people attended. During the peak period, about 450,000 inoculations were done in Sydney and 225,000 elsewhere in the state of New South Wales. In addition to those conducted privately by medical practitioners who were supplied with 150,000 doses. In total, over 800,000 doses were administered, and assuming that people did what they were supposed to do, received 2 shots, that means just over 400,000 people, or some 25% of the state population, were inoculated. In Sydney, the rate was higher, with 35 to 40% of the population inoculated. Newcastle wasn't singled out in statistics like that, but we do have some numbers summarising the impact of the flu in the region, as reported by pathologist Robert Dick, the Hunter River Combined District's Medical Officer of Health. As elsewhere, it was felt in 2 waves, with peaks between the 6th and 19th of April, brought down by the restrictions on public assembly and the requirement to wear masks, brought in on the 11th of April, and a higher peak of cases running from the 25th of May through the month of June. Dick, who had recently returned from war service in Europe, found the disease in the Hunter, and I quote him, "did not differ in any respects from the types seen by me in England and amongst troops in France." As elsewhere, he found that children were not as badly affected, but adult men were. And in his opinion, it was partly because of the tendency of men to soldier on and ignore advice that patients should take bed rest as soon as any symptoms were shown. So it was just under 500 deaths in the Hunter district through the period of the disease. So thinking about inoculation, was it worth it? Or should it be viewed as on a par with the inhalation chambers and the pastils of 1919, or the various fake cures currently being touted for coronavirus? When reports came to be written on the pandemic in Australia, it was said that inoculation had been effective at saving lives. Certainly Australia's death rate was much lower than that of countries which were affected by the ferocious second wave of the disease, places with vulnerable populations like India and some Pacific islands, and countries where fewer preparations have been made. New South Wales Premier William Holman presented statistics on nurses in influenza hospitals who'd all been immunised, showing that only 3 of 400 who came down with the flu had died, and arguing that this showed that inoculation was working. And there were also favourable results in the Victorian railway worker population. Overall, the death rate was calculated as 3 times higher for the uninoculated than the inoculated. And in New Zealand, where, as I've said, there was no inoculation undertaken, the death rate was 4.7 per thousand, as against 1.6 per thousand for New South Wales and 1.7 per thousand for Victoria. So a much higher rate in New Zealand. In the official report on the flu in New South Wales, there was a recommendation that in any future epidemic, shots should be taken every 4 to 6 weeks. However, when in retrospective studies of the flu, medical scientists were less convinced that it had had such a positive impact. And they were really awaiting the identification of the flu virus, and it wasn't until the 1930s that it was actually able to be isolated, and then specific anti-flu vaccines could be developed. So just to conclude, in the search for precedents and parallels with COVID-19, inoculation is one which so far seems largely to have been overlooked, as it has been in many histories of the Spanish flu, perhaps because it was developed too late to play much of a role in Europe or North America, other than in the west of the US. It may be that when vaccines for COVID-19 begin to be trialled, interest in this aspect will rise. Will we also have restrictions on movement for the unimmunized? Will we have free clinics held at convenient times and places? Will we have immunization passports which allow us to board a plane or attend a theater show or a history seminar? Certainly there will be controversy, and the anti-vaxxers are already mounting their arguments against vaccines that don't yet exist. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting and very timely too. We've got a couple of questions here from the presenters. They're obviously from our from our audience. And there's, of course, there's some questions inviting you to tease out conversations around anti-vax conversations today. Is that there's a question here about general education areas and scientific principles, and if you can make some comparisons about the general knowledge of the public then and now. I've been struck in by your talking about the fact that this post-war period is one where you've got a modern nation state, a kind of militarised population in many ways, who are still ambivalent about the state having so much control over their body. And I was wondering, if you were thinking about that in terms of the comparison, how people were feeling about the state control over the body.
Yeah, well, as I tried to articulate, there were a lot of kind of conscientious objectors to the immunisation program, and who it was voluntary, so people did not have to go. And I think Sydney, with estimates that around 40% of the population submitted to it, was about the highest. So the majority decided that it wasn't something they wanted to do for one reason or another. And I think that part of that would be that they've come through wartime, they've been told what to do for a long time, and they'd like to start thinking for themselves. And if they did have concerns and rationales for why they didn't think it was either healthy or useful for them to be immunised, then they were able to act on those beliefs. And even that Victorian Railways population, there were 10,000 people employed by them, and again about 40% took the inoculation and about 60% declined too.
Yeah. We've also got a question, which probably a few people are keen to hear about. Just were the injections clean? Were the syringes changed for every person? I
don't know that level of detail. I would suspect not. I mean, we're not in an era back in the early 20th century where things being disposable the way that they are now was really considered, and so they would have durable medical equipment, and then they would sanitize it and so on. But I really don't know whether that would have happened between each patient, whether they had sufficient equipment.
Yeah.
In terms of personnel, I think one of the things I forgot to mention about the sort of wrapping up of the inoculation program once the cases started to occur in the community in Australia was that the nursing staff were redeployed to actually look after the sick people rather than to try to keep people healthy. So I guess that's another example where there are shortages of all kinds of personnel and supplies and so on, because this is such an extraordinary call on the nation's resources, but at the same time as people are still coming home from the war and they're just not available to do even their regular jobs.
So what do you think? You mentioned at the beginning of your talk that you thought that this was an opportunity for us to start to think about how we might get ahead of the curve in terms of when a strategy for when a vaccine is discovered here for us. How can we get ahead of the curve? What are the lessons from history here?
Yeah. So I guess I was just being a bit playful that, as things become dinner party conversation, if we still have dinner parties, that, people have been talking about masks and social distancing, and the next thing will be about immunization. I'm not sure, because I think when a vaccine comes, maybe it will be around it being a free choice and people not feeling that they are forced into taking the immunization, as people clearly didn't feel that they were forced and were not forced at this time. Because I think that, we will get more kickback, and maybe we saw a little bit of that even with the app, the contact tracing app, where people could see yes, I could see how that would be useful. But on the other hand, I don't want to have government surveillance of my whereabouts and who I'm in contact with. And so I think if and the government, in their favor, were quite clear that they weren't going to make it compulsory. And so, I guess I would expect to see something similar. Although, again, there could be the leveraging that happens, like, well, you're not going to get on a train if you're not immunized.
Right.
You don't have to be immunized, but you don't have to use public transportation either. And especially back then, that was much more important to people because they didn't have private conveyance.
Yeah. I was struck by in your talk also, by the high levels of speculation around problem solving and prevention that you outlined. It seems like there is much less speculation going on now about how to cure and prevent, that we've sort of resisted that impulse to try and solve the problem too much.
Well, I don't know, Kiera. Maybe you're not on the right Facebook pages, and you're not linked into the right. There are a lot. I mean, and we've certainly heard it coming out of the United States, some quite outrageous.
Right. Yes. Yeah.
I believe one person died from. I don't know what he did with a pool cleaning, aquarium cleaning agent, and there was the talk of bleach, anti-malaria drugs being taken inappropriately. So I think there are some people taking it upon themselves to come up with what they think are solutions to this current problem. But maybe we're not seeing the very low level ones, like some sort of a throat lozenge you could take and protect yourself against COVID-19. I haven't seen any like that. They seem to be much more dramatic, the ones that people are promoting.
And you're right, I'm not really surfacing across the material. So we've just, Janet Pelosi is just making a comment that some 1919 articles call for nursing staff to come forward so that they would also be insured. These articles also note such people as doctors and nurses were reluctant to do so because of the deaths of doctors, for example, at Moore Park emergency. So I think that might be a comment about the extent to which nursing and medical staff in generally, do we have stats about how they engage with the inoculation?
Well, we did have that one from New South Wales, where all of the nurses, everyone who was working as a nurse, had to be inoculated, and then there was quite a low death rate amongst that group who would have had high exposure to the flu. So, I mean, I guess it does just come down to it not being a prevention, but it's just not allowing the disease to in most cases, to get to those final stages with the secondary bacterial infections that were often what actually killed people. And, the name pneumonic influenza suggests that that's where the problem lies.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.